Come, let us sing to the Lord. Come, let us bow down before Him. His banner is love over us, and His mercies are new every morning. And I'll sing, oh.
Oh, have watched as you drove back the sea that swallowed up my everything. I have walked from the shore to the deep, and through it all, you were there. Mighty Redeemer, rags and made us beautiful. For all that you've done, we will pour out our love. This will be our anthem song. Oh, Jesus, we love you. Oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore. Oh, Jesus, we love you. Oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore. Our affection, our devotion poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion poured out on the feet of Jesus. Our affection, our devotion poured out on the feet of Jesus. We love you. Oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore. Jesus, we love you. Oh, how we love you. You are the one our hearts adore. We adore you, Jesus, our one and only. We adore you, Jesus, our truest love. Lord God, enthroned in the heavens, where radiant beams of light abound. Your glory, it burns as a fire, your infinite presence all around. Yet you, great God, have called me as your own. A greater love no one has ever known. So beautiful, so wonderful is your love. unending is your love. Oh God, your love for me, forgiving, sustaining is your love. Oh God, your love for me, it's unfailing, unending is your love. Oh God, your love for me, it's forgiving, sustaining is your love. Oh God, your love for me is so beautiful, so wonderful is your love for me. It's so beautiful, so wonderful is your love for me. It's your love for me. It's all I need. Keep me in your love. Keep me in your love.
Good evening, All People's Church. Welcome to part 6 of the teaching on biblical theology of race. Tonight I'm hoping to wrap up the Old Testament part of this series. I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try. Last week we talked about Phinehas the priest and the significance of his life in the Bible's narrative in regards to race. I heard there were some technical difficulties with the video during the live stream. So I hope that you took the time to go back and watch the rest of the message when you had an opportunity. You know, you can always find all of our messages on our Facebook page or on YouTube. On YouTube, you just search for All People's Church Lynchburg, and you'll find our private page on there that has all of our previous messages and sermons from all of the great speakers that we have that are a part of our house, and even some from outside our house. We also have a podcast channel. If you're more of an audio type person, our podcasts are available on iTunes and Spotify and places like that. So there's lots of ways for you to listen in to what we're sharing. Okay, tonight I really want to talk to you about what I'm trying to get to is the prophets of the Old Testament and how what they had to say weighs into this whole biblical discussion, this whole biblical worldview of race. But in order to be able to do that, I feel like I have to talk some more about the history of the ancient world and what was going on during the monarchy years of Israel. So if you're not a history buff, your eyes might gloss over a bit. I understand. But if we don't talk about history, then we lack significant context. And if we lack context, then our interpretation of the Bible gets skewed. And if our interpretation of the Bible gets skewed, then our theology is off. And I don't want my theology to be off. And if I ask most of you, I would bet that your answer would be that you don't want your theology to be off either. So we have to talk a little history. As I have said, probably in week 2 or so, we're going to go over some more detail about the land of Cush. I keep emphasizing Cush because it was from this territory that you had black Africans, and they played a significant part in the narrative of the Old Testament. And I think it is very important because many people in the church and outside of the church have tried to minimize the role of African people in Christianity, either, just through ignorance, by reading their Bible and just having that subtle bias that we talked about in week number 2, the cultural pre-understandings that skew the story for us, So either through that or through just straight bigotry, trying to make the Bible express ideas that it clearly does not express. So I keep emphasizing the role that Cush and its people had in biblical events to show you that God is truly for all people. He does not look at the outward appearance as he says that men do, but he enters into relationship with whoever will come into covenant with him. So it's important for our proper biblical theology and worldview. So let's talk about Cush as a nation for a few minutes, because Cush played a significant role in the geopolitical affairs of the ancient Near East. It was a very powerful country in its day. In the various historical records before the time of Christ, it is well documented that there were black Cushite soldiers serving in the armies of Greece and Carthage and Egypt and Assyria and Israel and Judah and Persia, as well as in the military of their own country, of course. And so from about 715 BC to 663 BC, you have Cush. They actually were ruling Egypt in the 25th dynasty. And because they took control of Egypt, that made them players on the worldwide scene against Assyria. Now, of course, we know lots about Assyria because they were a primary harasser of Israel and Judah in the Old Testament. The monarchical period of Israel was from about 1020 BC to 580 BC, sometime like that, which completely overlaps the same time that Cush had soldiers in these foreign armies when they ruled Egypt. And because Israel and Judah stood geographically between Assyria and Egypt, this would have meant God's people were caught in the middle on one side or other of these two major world powers continually for roughly over a period of 500 years when they had their kings. Cush and Egypt's history is larger than that. Their interaction spans with one another over the course of about 3,000 years. They were often enemies, and they frequently went to war with one another. One of the primary reasons for that is because Cush was a land of gold. They had a tremendous amount of gold mines and thus wealth that came with that. And of course, Egypt wanted the gold. Egypt often had the upper hand, even to the point where Cush, in certain periods of time, was basically considered just a part of Egypt. But as I mentioned a little earlier, there was a period of time when Cush actually came out on top of that arrangement and they ruled Egypt. So because there was this constant interaction between these two countries, and because Egypt was often on top in that arrangement, throughout a large portion of Egyptian history, the Egyptian army had Cushite military officers and Cushite soldiers. Egypt also had soldiers from other nations in its army, but the Cushites were by far and away the most prevalent and the most documented as being part of the military. As early as 2300 BC, there are historical records that document Cushite soldiers and Egypt using them to conduct raids up into the Asiatic portions of the Middle East, modern-day Turkey. Throughout the second millennium BC, Egypt pretty much dominated Cush. So the amount of Cushite auxiliary forces in the Egyptian army was significant. In 1887, there were some stone tablets that were found that contained significant writings. These tablets would come to be known as the Amarna letters. They were one of the first artifacts to be found that showed evidence of intentional international diplomacy taking place. They date from around the mid 14th century BC. It appears that they were written from a person in Canaan who was a vassal under Pharaoh. In this letter, on this stone tablet, this prince in Canaan is complaining to Pharaoh that a group of Cushite troops from the local Egyptian garrison has broken into his house and roughed him up a bit, apparently unprovoked. So this guy is writing back to Pharaoh to do something about his troops who are stationed in Canaan, and that these soldiers of Cush, this guy is saying that they need to be dealt with for their behavior. They need to be held accountable. So we can see from these documents that Egypt had military garrisons far outside of its own country. And in this case, that garrison of troops was made up of Cushite warriors. So obviously, if Egypt had Cushite troops stationed in Canaan, they could have had them stationed in other places of the world too. One of the interesting things about Cushite is most of their soldiers were bowmen. In the ancient Near East, Cush was known for warriors that were experts with the bow and arrow. The Egyptians even called the land of Cush the land of the bow. There was a tomb that was excavated, and they estimate that it's around from 2500 to 2000 BC. And archaeologists found a skeleton of a young man that was lying on his side with a bow in his hand. And in the tomb of one of the pharaohs from about 2040 BC, there are models of more than 40 Cushite soldiers, and they're all carrying bows in their hands. So some of the archaeologists believe that these might have been the personal guard of the pharaoh, and that's what the models represent. So for most of their history of Cush, those warriors from there were regarded as competent archers. The other thing they had going for them as a reputation in the military was cavalry. They had a significant reputation for producing quality horses that could pull chariots. All right, let's talk about the monarchy, and we're going to begin with King David, right? I mean, how do you mention the monarchy of Israel without starting with the predominant figure of that Old Testament period? One thing that I think most people don't pay attention to, and something that I recognize as I was going through the Bible in my annual Bible reading like most of you, is how many foreigners were part of David's administration. Most of his entourage were not Israelites. This is illustrated probably the most in the story of Absalom, his own son who betrayed him. I think we all know this, right? Absalom manages to sow discord in the kingdom of Israel. Many people are swayed to follow this usurper, and it's the foreign troops and confidants of David that remain loyal to him during this situation. You have his own personal bodyguards recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and 2 Samuel chapter 15. The Kerethites are mentioned. Well, they were Cretans from the Isle of Crete. You have the Pelethites mentioned. Pelethites is just another word for Philistine. In 2 Samuel 15, this guy Ittai the Gittite is leading 600 men of King David as King David is fleeing Jerusalem. And the king basically tells him to stay put, right? But then in verse 21 of 2 Samuel 15, this is what David says. 2 Samuel 15:21. But Ittai answered the king and said, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be." So these 600 men that Ittai was leading, they were Philistines who were loyal to David. Later on down the line, King David rewards Ittai's loyalty with putting him in charge of 1/3 of his army. In 2 Samuel 23, we see 3 of David's mighty men listed: Uriah, Igal, and Zelek. Those guys were not Israelites. Uriah was a Hittite. Almost everybody knows that. Every time they talk about him, they call him Uriah the Hittite. So he was not an Israelite. Igal was from Sabora, which was an Aramean kingdom in the south of Syria. That was just north of Israel. And Zelek was an Ammonite. So these three guys were part of David's 30, his loyal warriors, his mighty men. And these guys weren't just loyal to David. I mean, it's very safe to say that they loved David as a leader and as a man, and they were all willing to follow him to his death. But at the end of the story of Absalom, we see in 2 Samuel chapter 18 that there's a Cushite involved in David's army. Joab has just killed Absalom, contrary to the request of King David, who gave orders that he did not want him harmed. But then Joab chooses a Cushite to deliver the message to King David. I'm going to read 2 Samuel chapter 18, beginning in verse 19. I'll read to verse 21. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me now run and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you've seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. Now, with all that we've discussed about the frequent appearance of Cushite soldiers in various armies around the known world at that time, we should not now be surprised to see that David has a Cushite as a part of his army, as a part of his loyal followers. This Cushite shows up on the scene, if you will, literally in the moments after Absalom's death. So this would indicate that he's a soldier and not just a messenger. Cushites later in history would earn a further reputation militarily as being good runners and messengers as battle would play out. They were often chosen because they had this speed and stamina, and they could deliver news from the battle lines at the front back to the king or the ruler in the rear in a timely manner. And because delivering these kind of messages often required interaction with the king or interaction with Pharaoh, not just anybody was a messenger. I mean, they wanted a person that had a certain sense of diplomacy and poise and even eloquence. Now, in a lot of biblical commentaries on this passage, some notable commentaries, many scholars try to explain the decision by Joab to use a Cushite to deliver the news as being attributed to the idea that the Cushite was a slave. One commentator said that this guy was used because the task he was carrying out was more suitable to a slave. Another commentator said Joab wanted to use this slave in case David reacted to the news of his death, reacted to the news of the death of his son with violence, like a literal killing of the messenger. And that had happened before with David, so maybe there was good reason for that. But this is where that cultural pre-understanding can jump up and bite you, even if you're a biblical scholar. Just because this Cushite was a black man in service to the king does not make him a slave. There's no mention in the text that he was a slave. I believe it mentions that he was a servant of the king, but that's not synonymous with being a slave. And the history of Palestine provides no evidence that Cushites were commonly slaves during this time. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked about Cushite slaves in Egypt because Egypt had captured them during military campaigns. But that was true for all nationalities during this period of history, not just Cushites. Any invading army could make slaves of the people that they had just conquered. The Israelites did it. The Assyrians carrying off the Israelites into captivity when they came down is another example. Anybody could be anybody else's slave when it came to the results of war. But there's no reason to automatically correlate only Cushites as slaves because they were in service to another group of people. As we read throughout the Old Testament narrative, there's people of all kinds of nations mentioned. I can't find an instance where the commentators automatically assume that those people from these other nations are slaves just because of who they are. When they comment on Uriah the Hittite, or Egal the Aramean, or Zelek the Ammonite, they don't automatically put those guys into the position of slaves for King David, but they seem to jump to that conclusion whenever there's a discussion of Cushites without any real explanation for why they're making that assertion. And so we do see this issue of cultural pre-understanding playing out in their scholarly work. Now, it may be unintentional, but it's obvious that they've taken some assumptions with the stories. That if a black man is mentioned in a biblical story, he's not in some sort of leadership role, he must have automatically been a slave. But in the cases like this from 2 Samuel chapter 18, there is no historical or textual support for that conclusion. So instead of just allowing what the text says and what history says and what culture from that time period says about the text, some of these commentators are bringing their own biased cultural pre-understanding, and it's infecting their commentary. And it's not okay, even if it's done subconsciously or accidentally. I mean, given the evidence we have, it's highly probable that their interpretations, and thus their commentary on these interpretations in these instances, are errors in their biblical commentaries. And they should be called out, and they should be fixed. Listen, I'm no professional biblical scholar, but with 10 minutes of research, I can see the error in their scholarly work, and surely they could do the same. Okay, as to the story itself, we don't know why Joab picked the Cushite over Ahimaaz to deliver the news. The Bible does not say that Joab was afraid David would kill the messenger. And this Cushite was awfully sure of himself when he showed up on scene. So we're going to read what else happens beginning in the 18th chapter with the 22nd verse. And we're going to read down to verse 32. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab. Now this is after the Cushite has left. But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. So Joab said, Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready? But whatever happens, he said, let me run. So Joab said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, If he is alone, there is news in his mouth. And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called out to the gatekeeper and said, There is another man running alone. And the king said, He also brings news. So the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. Apparently they knew what that guy ran like. And the king said, He is a good man and comes with good news. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, All is well. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. The king said, Is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about. And the king said, Turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you. And the king said to the Cushite, Is the young man Absalom safe? So the Cushite answered, May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. Now, based on what I just read in that passage, I think this accounting actually helps dispute the idea that the Cushite was a slave. In the reporting of this incident, it's Ahimaaz who says, all is well. King David flatly asks him how Absalom is, and Ahimaaz says, well, there was this great battle, and I'm not sure what it was all about. Now, what's up with that? You beg Joab to go and tell the king the news. You ask him before. Joab sends the Cushite, and you ask him again. He says, okay, go. And then you get to the king, and you're like, yeah, I don't know what happened. Well, why are you running then? What made you decide you needed to be the guy to run? I mean, you run from the battlefront to say, I don't know anything? Maybe David should have killed the messenger for being incompetent. I noticed that both Ahimaaz and the Cushite are both referred to as the servant of the king. Ahimaaz obviously wasn't a slave. On top of that, Ahimaaz says, Blessed be the Lord your God who has delivered you. And I thought that was interesting because there's no ownership there of God on the part of Ahimaaz. So then the Cushite shows up and he says, I have good news. The Lord has avenged you. And he gives the news to King David straight. Absalom is dead, and the Cushite says, let it be so for anyone who would rise up against you. So while Ahimaaz is being all political and frankly underhanded because he did know the truth, the Cushite is bold and direct with delivering the news to the king that his own son is dead. That doesn't exactly express to me the mentality of a slave. The Cushite was blunt, he was direct, and he was honest with King David. We should also see this Cushite interaction as another good sign from our biblical theology of race perspective. This is a positive association. This Cushite is on David's side. He's a part of David's army. He is coupled together with the other foreign actors who all show that when David's own people turn their backs on him, these foreigners unite together and are on his side. The further implications are that the people of Israel turn their back on God and his designated leader by following Absalom, and these foreigners were loyal to David and thus loyal to the God of Israel and who he chose as a leader. Remember what Ittai the Philistine said to David as he was fleeing Jerusalem. As the Lord lives, I'm not going to abandon you. The next time that we see Cushites, in particular as soldiers, they're part of an enemy force. Shishak was the king of Egypt and the founder of the 22nd dynasty. He plays an active role in helping to destroy Solomon's kingdom. He gives Jeroboam asylum in Egypt and protects him. Solomon ends up dying. We know that Israel splits into the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. We're going to take a look at what happens in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 25 through 28. So in verse 25 of 1 Kings 14, it says, It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made. Then King Rehoboam made bronze shields in their place and committed them to the hands of the captains of the guard who guarded the doorway of the king's house. So whenever the king entered the house of the Lord, the guards carried them, then brought them back into the guard room. So Shishak comes to Jerusalem and plunders it, and King Rehoboam is quick to kowtow to him. This invasion is also recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 12. In verse 3 of 2 Chronicles chapter 12, the Bible notes that the Cushites were part of the Egyptian invading army. Years later, 2 Chronicles chapter 14, I'm going to read this passage too, beginning in verse 9. Now remember, I'm reading the King James Version, and the King James Version, as we talked about in week 2, always translates the Hebrew term for Cush as Ethiopia, but it's not Ethiopia, it's Cush, and these are Cushites. So 2 Chronicles chapter 14, beginning in verse 9. Then Zerah the Ethiopian, that would have been a Cushite, came out against them with an army of 1,000,000 men and 300 chariots. How do you have 1,000,000 soldiers but only 300 chariots? I don't know. And he came to Mareshah. So Asa went out against him, and they set the troops in battle array in the valley of Zephathah at Mareshah. And Asa cried out to the Lord his God and said, Lord, it is nothing for you to help, whether with many or with those who have no power. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rest on you, and in your name we go against this multitude. Come on, Jesus. O Lord, you are God. Do not let man prevail against you. So the Lord struck the Cushites before Asa and Judah, and the Cushites fled. And Asa and the people who were with him pursued them to Gerar. So the Ethiopians, the Cushites, were overthrown, and they could not recover, for they were broken before the Lord and his army, and they carried away very much soil. Then they defeated all the cities around Gerar, and the fear of the Lord came upon them, and they plundered all the cities, for there was exceedingly much spoil in them. They also attacked the livestock enclosures and carried off sheep and camels in abundance and returned to Jerusalem. So unlike Rehoboam, who capitulates to his invader, Asa puts his trust in God and comes out of this battle with a huge victory. This guy Zerah has 1,000,000-man army, and he gets defeated. Can you imagine standing on a battlefield and looking across at 1,000,000 people that are on the other side? That's crazy. It's believed that this guy Zerah was a Cushite general under the pharaoh Asoracon I. There's a verse in 2 Chronicles 16. It's verse 8 where this battle's basically being recounted. This is a message from a prophet, a seer, to Asa, king of Judah. Verse 8, it says, were the Ethiopians, the Cushites, and the Lubim not a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. So this verse is recounting the victory for Asa, reminding him that it had come from the Lord. And if it's translated properly, the Ethiopians were Cushites, and the Lubim were Libyans. And this makes complete sense, historically speaking, because Asoracon I was a Libyan pharaoh of Egypt. So it makes perfect sense that his army would have been comprised of Cushites and Libyan soldiers. Now, let's go forward in time to the 9th century BC. It's around this time that the Neo-Assyrian Empire is rising. And this is when Israel and Judah really get into the thick of it, because they're caught, as I said earlier, between Egypt to the southwest and Assyria to the north. And the Assyrians would end up being a real pain in Israel's neck for over 200 years. As the Assyrians kind of rise in power, you see Egypt declining in power. In 853 BC, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, he tries to invade Syria and Israel. Israel has this small alliance of nations down there, and they're able to hold him off. And even Egypt contributed to that alliance, but they only contributed 1,000 troops. So for a nation the size of Egypt, that wasn't very much support. I think they were kind of hedging their bets on maybe who would come out of that battle. 75 years later, a Cushite king rises to power in Egypt named Pianki. And for about 57 years, you have the Cushites are actually ruling Egypt. And this also brings to bear some significant relationship between Egypt and Judah. And that's important to point out because it creates this huge historical backdrop for a lot of the Old Testament stories that come down the line. So they had these good diplomatic relations. You could say that there would have been a good number of Cushite soldiers and diplomats and merchants that were moving through Judah and even in Judah. And there would have also been a good number of people from Judah that were merchants and diplomats down in the Cushite-ruled kingdom of Egypt. The Cushites also tried to maintain normal relationships with the Assyrians during this time. There's a lot of Assyrian texts from this period of history that show that the Assyrians primarily got the horses for their chariots, for their cavalry units from the Cushites. Some of you may recall the story of Tiglath-Pileser III, who's mentioned in 2 Kings 15 and 16. He's also mentioned in 1 Chronicles 5. He actually established an Assyrian trading post down in Egypt just so he could specifically trade for Cushite horses for his chariots. So the Cushites and the Assyrians, they had pretty good relationships with one another up until the point where Assyria decided to wipe out Israel and took Israel off into captivity. All right, when the Cushites see that happen, it's believed that they see that incursion as a threat to their own existence, right? So there's even some Assyrian art that depicts some of these battles with Israel that shows Cushite soldiers fighting alongside of Israelite soldiers against the Assyrians. Another Assyrian king we see in 2 Kings is Sennacherib. He was in open war with the Cushites. Just shortly after 700 BC, around 702 BC, the new Cushite king Sebiktu becomes the next pharaoh of Egypt. Sennacherib is trying to establish a firm control on the Palestinian era during this time. I know I've preached before on this particular campaign because it involves the story of King Hezekiah of Judah. King Hezekiah initially gets Sebiktu to help defend Judah against Sennacherib. But this is where Sennacherib comes down and sieges Lachish as part of his campaign. And then again, in some Assyrian art, there's this picture of the siege of Lachish. And in this picture, the enemy soldiers of Lachish are black men. And they're depicted in the same style as how Cushites are depicted throughout the rest of Assyrian art. So I know that most of you are going to know the story of King Hezekiah. You know, he tries to buy off the Assyrians with tribute. They accept the tribute, and then they attack anyway. And you have the Rabshakeh, the Assyrian commander of armies. He comes down and delivers this great speech over Jerusalem, and he's mocking King Hezekiah, and he's saying, don't believe Hezekiah, don't believe God, neither one of them are going to help you. Fear the king of Assyria. And we know how this turns out, right? He sends this letter to King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah takes it to the house of God. He lays it on the altar. He says, Lord, look at what these people are saying. Look at what they're saying about you. And the Lord responds, right? I mean, it's a great story. The Lord sends a prophetic word by the mouth of the prophet Isaiah. And it's declared in that prophetic word that the Assyrian king's insolence towards the Lord has reached the Lord's ears. And the Lord says, I'm going to put a hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I'm going to send you right back the way you came. And then the Lord sends his angel, who goes out and kills 185,000 of the Assyrian army. And then the Assyrians take their ball and go home. And I love that story. In the historical writings of Assyrian history, they actually mention that the campaign of Sennacherib against King Hezekiah wasn't successful, but they leave out the details as to why it wasn't successful. And I can imagine so. It's pretty hard to explain that an angel of God came in and wiped out your army. But anyway, God's victory over the army is significant, and it is the main point of that passage. But let's also not neglect the point that King Hezekiah, who was a righteous king, had an alliance with a black pharaoh and an army of black soldiers fighting with him and the kingdom of Judah against the Assyrians. It's another positive relationship between God's people and the Cushites. 674 BC, Esarhaddon, the next Assyrian king, manages to push all the way down into Egypt. He's mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 19. He's the guy that literally takes the Cushites out of power in Egypt, and they end up retreating back to their own country. And then for the next 8 years or so, there is this back and forth between Egypt in Egypt between the Assyrians and Cushites. Whenever the Assyrians would pull the major part of their army back and leave, a small military unit in charge and some leaders to run Egypt, the Cushites would come up from the north and kill everybody and try and take everything back over. And then the Assyrians would flood back down into Egypt and try and put down the rebellion. And the Cushites would retreat back south. And so finally, in about 663, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who is mentioned in the book of Ezra, he comes all the way down into the city of Thebes, which for a long time had been the real seat of power for Cushites in Egypt. And he levels the city. He completely destroys it. And once he does that, that pretty much ends the Cushites' rebellion. As a matter of fact, from that point, they never again try and build an empire or get into the conquering of other nations. They pretty much give up the whole war thing, and they resort to just trading with Egypt and the other nations of the ancient Near East. I mean, it must have been a crushing defeat for them as a people. You still see history revealing Cushite soldiers involved with different nations' militaries throughout the line. The Greek historian Herodotus documents Cushite troops in the army of the Persian king Xerxes. He describes them as troops who wore leopard skins and lion skins and who carried extremely long bows for weapons. There's Greek art from the 6th and 5th centuries that BC that also portray black soldiers as part of Greek armies. It's quite possible that Cushite soldiers were serving as mercenaries throughout the Greek world. The same can be said of Cyprus. There's been stone figures that have been found in Cyprus that appear to depict Cushite troops invading Cyprus with an Egyptian army from around that time. So, all right, judging by the time, I think I'm going to stop there. Next week, we're going to talk about what the prophets had to say in the Old Testament, and that will wrap up our discussion of the biblical theology of race from the Old Testament. Then we're probably looking at about just 2 or 3 weeks of review of the New Testament. We'll talk about the makeup of the New Testament world and the various people groups that we're going to encounter there. We'll talk about the biblical theology of race, anything we find in the Gospels. And we'll talk about the biblical theology of race and anything we find in the writings of the Apostle Paul. Hope I didn't bore you. I know the history stuff can sometimes be a yawner, but for me, I always love to see all the confirmation between the Word of God and the different proofs of history. I love when these articles come out that they found these archaeological finds of documents and relics and treasures that continue to affirm the Word of God as truth. So I think the history is important. And as I said earlier, it's important to know, to set the backdrop for what we're reading in these Old Testament narratives. I mean, I don't know that you can sit through what we've been talking about in this series and then sit down with your Bible and read the Old Testament in the same way ever again. I mean, anyone who's been through this study with us is now going to have a richer, fuller understanding of just who these people are and what they look like versus just imagining what they are and who they look like. So the Lord bless you this week. Stay safe, stay healthy. I know everyone is anxious to get back together. You know, even though Governor Northam moved Virginia into stage 3 of reopening on July 1st, there's still no indication from the Methodist Conference of Virginia that the bishop plans on proceeding with easing her restrictions. I checked their website this week, and the only information they have is about stage 2 guidance, which, as I said, several weeks ago, was just overbearing in my opinion. But fear not, people of God. Some good things are in the works, so stay tuned. I love you guys, and we'll see you later.
Everything that's in me, bless His holy name. 'Cause when I bless Him, things will change. Everything that's in me, bless His holy name. My praise is a weapon. Yes, it is. My praise is a weapon. Everything, come on. Everything that's in me, hey, bless His holy name. Oh, everything that's in me, hey, bless His holy name. Come on, church, say it. Everything that's in me, bless His holy name. Oh, everything that's in me, bless His holy name. So we lift Him high, forever lift Him high, high within our hearts, high within our lives. Jesus, You alone are our cornerstone, high within our hearts, high within our lives. So we lift You high, forever lift You high, high within our hearts, high within our lives. Jesus, You alone